Okay, my name is Gary Warsham. I'm with Remote.it Support, and today I'm going to be talking about how to make connections using the remote.it API. Here's our agenda. We're going to just have an overview of the API, when to use it, and then the 4 steps shown here as far as what it takes to actually make a proxy connection with our API. You'll get the most out of this webinar if you know what remote.it is and you've used remote.it. You have familiarity with a REST API, and you have some basic scripting experience using Bash or the C shell in Linux, including pipes, sed, awk, and grep. So when should you use the remote.it connection API? Well, I'm going to show you something over here in the actual remote.it user interface. Whenever you go into our web portal and click on a service name to get a connection, you are in fact using the remote.it API, although it's behind our web page. And so you may choose to use the remote.it connection API if you're writing your own application, which needs to make remote.it connections, or if you're integrating remote.it connections into an existing application or ecosystem. If you're somewhat familiar with remote.it, you also understand that we support peer-to-peer connections, also called P2P connections. So the proxy or API-based connection should be considered as a backup or failover for P2P connections which fail. Sometimes there are certain network conditions where peer-to-peer connections will not work, but proxy connections will. Also, since peer-to-peer connections require a connectd daemon to be installed on the client, if for whatever reason you're unable to do that, then you can also use the API in order to make connections. So the remote.it API lives at this address. It's a standard REST API using GET and POST messages. You'll see in the details as we get into them that you need to include your developer key. Most calls require a token, and everything is encoded in JSON, which is formatted text. We'll see quite a bit of that in just a few minutes. The status response of each API call includes a key called status, and if the value of the status key is true, then the rest of the information is valid and can be used. But if it's false, then you should look at the value of the key reason for an explanation of the failure. And you should also deal with those types of failure and error messages in your own code as you're developing it. And as I said before, we'll show some examples. So here's an overview of the workflow involved in making and using a proxy connection. You start with the user login API endpoint, and you supply this with your username, password, and developer key, and this gives you a login token. Now I've just shown the login token here is pointing down here, but as you can see, it's actually used in every subsequent API call. Also, the developer key is used in all API calls. But in any case, you first get the login token and give that to the device find by name along with the device or service name which you want to connect to. And this will come back with some information, including the device address. Now, the device address is what the key is called in the JSON response. This corresponds to the service ID in the web portal user interface. Once you get the device address, you use that to make a proxy connection, and the end result of this will be a proxy URL and proxy port sometimes, in the general case, along with a connection ID. At this point, when you get these things, you're able to use this information to make a connection, whether it's to an SSH server, VNC, Samba, whatever you have set up on your device. And then finally, when you're done, you'll want to stop the connection, and this turns off that particular proxy connection so that it's no longer valid. I'm just going to go quickly here through the details of the various APIs which I've just discussed. This is the login endpoint. And one thing to know about login tokens is that they will expire after about 8 hours. So The code that you use should be able to anticipate an expired or invalid token and handle it appropriately, whether you just want to fail or request that the person log in again is up to your application. The required input, as I said before, is the developer key, and I'm going to show you where to get the developer key in the web portal. Over here on the left-hand side, you'll click on this little arrow and it pops up a submenu. Then you can go to Account and scroll down a bit. And here's your developer API key. If you click on this button, that will copy it to the clipboard, and then you can put that into your own scripts. And again, for the login, you need to supply a username and password, as you might expect. This is an example using the curl command written in a shell programming language. And this just shows the actual structure of a curl command, including the expressions for the developer key and various other things that are required in order for this to succeed. Now, this is appropriate if you're programming in a shell language. We also have at our website at docs.remote.it, we have examples for these API endpoints in PHP, Python, Node.js, and C#. And if you are developing in something other than those languages, let us know if you can't figure out how to use it. Typically, modern languages will have some sort of calls for making HTTP requests. So that's the sort of thing that you will use. So moving right along, the user login will, when it gets valid input, will respond. And the actual response of the user login API endpoint includes much more information than this, but what I've shown here are some of the important bits, and especially the token which will be returned that you'll need to use. And other possibilities could include invalid key if you made a mistake in the developer key, or incorrect password or username. Those would also come back in the response JSON. Next, the device find by name API endpoint. Again, takes a developer key and a token. And then for the search parameters, you're going to put in the device name. And the device name is actually the service name. Again, this is sort of a terminology discrepancy that you'll need to be aware of. In the web portal, we refer to these things as services, but the metadata that's been defined refers to this as a device name. So you put the actual name that you gave it when you set it up here. And device state, since we're going to be trying to connect to it, you'll use active for the state. And here's the response that you might expect to a valid call to this API endpoint. And the part that's important here is the device address. And the device address is the same as the service ID, which you'll see here for each individual service. So one thing I wanted to point out is that if you already know the service ID from the web UI, if you happen to be using that, you can bypass this particular call. But in the general case, you don't know the service ID unless you've memorized it. It's easier to refer to it by the service name. And if you made a mistake in the setting up the search parameters, you could get this error response. Finally, once you have the service ID, you're going to want to make a proxy connection to a device. Here's some familiar things: the developer key and the token, the device address, which we just got from the previous call, but also there's a wait parameter here. This says whether you want to wait for the connection or not. This should be set to true. I think there was a legacy version where you didn't wait, but in general, you will always want to wait for the connection to become active before the call returns. And then the host IP field here is actually used in a feature which we call IP restriction. And I want to show you over in the web portal. If you've ever seen this at the bottom of the services dialog, this is the same thing. When I click this checkbox to say make public, this disables the IP restriction, and it's controlling the value of this host IP parameter. So let me talk a little bit more about IP restriction. First of all, as I said already, the host IP parameter and the device connect API call will enforce or relax IP restriction. And the IP restriction makes sure that the public IP address of the computer making the connection matches the IP which requested the connection. And by the public IP address, I mean the external IP address that you would get by going to whatismyip.com, for example. And this host IP should be set to your public IP address to enforce IP restriction, or it should be set to 0.0.0.0 to allow others to temporarily use this URL and port for connections if desired. So that's the option in the web portal, as I showed you before, that makes this public and allows this to be shared for the life of the proxy. Now, connections on some mobile network at the client side especially will not succeed unless IP restriction is disabled. There's a technical issue with certain mobile networks. So finally, once we have the device address, and again, that's sometimes referred to as a service ID, we can use the device connect API endpoint to actually make a proxy connection. And there are two types of service endpoints, roughly speaking. I mean, if you look at the menu, you'll see many types of protocols: SSH, VNC, Samba, etc. But fundamentally, there are only two different types. One is a reverse proxy, and that is used by all web connections. And one thing you'll notice about reverse proxies is that they only have a host URL and there is no port on here, because reverse proxies for web servers do not do port remapping. Whereas the response from port proxy, which is used by all non-web connections such as SSH, VNC, RDP, etc., includes a remap port. So here the proxy includes a part, which is a proxy server in your geographic region, and also a randomized port over here, which is between 30,000 and 40,000. Other possible responses to device connect could include message that the device is not active, it's offline, which could happen possibly if it went offline after you got the service ID or device address. For some reason, the device is not owned by this account. That would probably happen if you made a mistake in the service ID or did something like transferred it to somebody else after you got it. So I guess there's a variety of fairly rare edge cases where that could happen. Or you happen to be using an expired login token. And the login token is generally valid for approximately 8 hours. However, it could expire sooner than that, or it could be valid for longer than that. So in the code that you write, you should anticipate the possibility of an expired login token. So once you're done using the proxy connection, you terminate the proxy connection by using this call. And again, you need the developer key and login token. And then you also need the device address and the connection ID, which came from the previous call. And on a valid call to this API endpoint, this will be the response. You'll get a status of true, and the connection ID will be the connection ID that you sent it. And other possibilities could be various error messages, and you will see that shown here under the reason in the case that status comes back as false. So I'm going to show you some examples using shell scripting, and these are just show you the most simple way of using the APIs in a shell script. And if you're not familiar with JSON, it's not necessarily, in fact, not at all, it's not designed to be read by human beings, even though it is text, but it's a bunch of formatted and key value pairs that are all jammed together on one line. So just for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to be using the sed, grep, and awk functions here to show you how I can filter out the things that I'm interested in looking for. And if you are writing shell scripts, you can actually use the same approach. Or if you're using a higher level programming language, like any of the ones that I mentioned, generally these will include much more flexible and powerful libraries that allow you to do easier JSON parsing. So I'm going to go over here to a terminal, and in this case, I'm actually running the Ubuntu subsystem of Windows 10, but this exact same thing should work fine on a Mac OS terminal or on a Raspberry Pi, or on an actual Linux PC of some sort. And I've written some scripts here to demonstrate these APIs. So the first one is the login. I'll just show you what this consists of. This is a script. I've identified these variables or constants. That's my developer key. That is my username, and that's my password. And this is a temporary account that I'm using for this demo, so I'm not really giving anything away by showing you this. And this is the command that you saw earlier that will come back with my login token. So let me just run that and I'll show you what happens. Okay, this is an example of some JSON that came back. And as you can see, that's pretty difficult. But what I'll do is I will, like I said before, I'll pipe it through sed, and I will replace commas with backslashes, and that will put one key value pair on each line. And then since I'm looking for a token, I'll use the grep function to find the token. And there's several keys that include the word token, token index, service token, and auth token. You can actually see that token and auth token are the same thing. So you can use either one of those in this case, and that will get put into the subsequent API calls. Okay, so the next API call I'm going to make is a device find by name. So I will show you what is in that one. And again, I have the token and the dev key, and then also the device name. And I prearranged this just so that it would be quicker to show you. So let me type this one in. We'll see what happens. Okay, so this is the JSON that comes back for device find by name. I'm going to do the same trick I did before, which is to filter it through sed. Okay, so that's one key value pair per line. I'm going to filter it again using grep on device address, which I know is what I'm looking for. I don't know why that keeps happening. Okay, so in fact, I got two matches here, and I'm not. If you were actually doing this in shell scripting language, then of course you would need to refine this a little bit using some other commands just to get that down to the single response. And I've already got this device address in my next call, which is the device connect call. Sorry, I should have showed you what it was first. I'll make a connection. Let me just start that over, I'm sorry. So I'm going to show you the device connect script. And again, we have token, developer key, the actual device address, and the host IP, which I've put to 000 just to not have any trouble with IP restriction. This is the structure of the curl call. So I've already made the device connect API call above here, and I'm going to again run that through my little sed filter. And I'm going to search for a proxy because I happen to know that some of the metadata that I'm looking for. Whoops, sorry, I should have said pipe grep proxy. Oh dear. Let me just see what I'm doing wrong. Oh, all right. I'm getting confused here, doing things out of order. Okay, sorry. All right, first thing, and then I will send that to grep. And this comes back with the proxy, which is the fully formed URL and port combined. And then we also have proxy port and proxy server. Since I know that this is an SSH endpoint and it's a Raspberry Pi, I'm going to use this information to log in SSH -L Pi and then proxy 18.rt3.io -p for the port, lowercase p, 39726. And this is making a proxy connection to my Raspberry Pi. I'll type in the password. And now I'm on my Raspberry Pi and I can do whatever I would normally do on my Raspberry Pi. Now, the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to just back up a little bit because you remember I said that when I terminate a proxy connection, I need to use the connection ID. So that came out up here. I'm just going to copy this. Okay. And I'll just do some things over here on the Pi that one might do to see that it really is a Raspberry Pi that I'm on right now. Okay, so I've done everything I want to on my Raspberry Pi, so I'm going to exit out of the connection. Now, the proxy connection is still active. And if I want to use it again, I can go ahead and use it again until such time that it expires, which similar to the login token could be up to 8 hours. I'm actually not going to do that at this time. What I am going to do is I'm going to edit the device connect stop script, and I'm going to replace this connection ID because that was for the previous demo we did with this one that we just created. Okay, so now I'm going to run this. And that comes back with a status of true, and then the ID, which just matches the same connection ID that we gave it before. And what you'll notice now is that when I attempt to use this proxy connection, that it is refused. It's no longer valid, which is exactly what we wanted. Now, if your proxy expires, the same thing will happen. So that's the sort of thing that you'll need to check for when you're actually using it. And if this happens and you weren't expecting it, it's probably the case that the proxy itself has expired. So at this point, I'm going to open it up for questions. Looks like a question has come in. Are there any negative ramifications to not terminating the proxy connection? Well, if first of all, the proxy connection will stay open for a number of hours. And if you don't terminate it and you also made it public or relaxed IP restriction, I suppose that there's a possibility that somebody who wasn't supposed to could connect to it. So if you use IP restriction, that becomes really exceedingly unlikely, but those are the theoretical ramifications of not terminating the proxy connection. So we do recommend that when you're using the API, that you do terminate the proxy connection. Is there an API to run a bulk script? This is a very common request. And at this point, we do not have a publicly usable API to run a bulk script. However, that is pretty high up on our list of things to implement so that people can use it. How long is the proxy address valid? And it is valid for about 8 hours. And like I said before, you should, in your code, count for all possible conditions, including an expired proxy, so you're not confused when perhaps things don't work when you think they should. In fact, we do have some stuff that's in development right now, which is actually a different approach to querying the databases through the APIs. I can't talk much about it right now, but the answer is definitely yes. We're planning on adding more API endpoints and abilities to do things more efficiently rather than downloading the entire device list, which we understand is a little time consuming and slow and clunky once you get, several thousand services in there. Suppose I want to use the APIs in some kind of a cross-platform application, such as Mac, Windows, Android, iOS. Is that possible? Well, the answer is yes. However, it does depend on your ability to add, for example, at the basic shell command level, you need curl with SSL support, and you should also have CA certificates installed so that we can support SSL, secure socket layer, properly communication back to the API server. There's a way to force it not to check certificates, but we don't really recommend that for a production solution. You could do that in evaluation. Also, if you're not using curl necessarily, as I mentioned before, many of the higher level languages do include HTTP request libraries, and you would want to use those along with the CA certificates so that you have SSL supported for those API calls.
Is there an API call to get all open connections to be closed? It's a good question. I'm unaware of any such API call. So if you're going to be managing connections, then you'll probably want to keep track of those connections in a list. And then when you want to clean up, go through that and close them all. I will also take this question back to engineering to see if maybe there's something that I'm unaware of. And we'll get that into the notes.
You are correct. The device find by name API endpoint is not yet documented at the docs.remote.it. I am going to have to add that after I get done with this webinar. So at this point, the documentation is in these slides, which we can send to you when we're done. And I will also put it up at the docs site. So here are some additional resources you can access, which I hope you will find useful for learning about remote in general and the APIs. This is all of our general purpose information. You should also check out our YouTube channel because there are some videos there about making P2P connections, which you should also know about. Here's some links directly into information about the remote API, peer-to-peer versus proxy connections, and making peer-to-peer connections. And if you have any questions, whether they're just theoretical or if you're having a problem trying to implement something with the API, I do hope that you will reach out and ask those questions because we are here to try to help you use the product. Thanks again. Bye-bye.